Good morning.
Good morning.
Does that sound okay? Not too loud? Trying to give some feedback. All right, well, it is just about 10:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to say thank you for being here. I know it's tough to show up for a session on the last day of a conference. Everybody's tired, especially after last night. It's even tougher to present on the last day. Originally, I think I was supposed to present this session on yesterday, and it got moved. So if you guys will try to stay awake and stay with me, I'll do the same. And if you start to fall asleep, I've got this Progress Test Studio bug swatter, and I'll smack you or get Zach to smack you if you're not paying attention. So, but thanks for being here. I talked to a lot of you when you came in the room. It sounds like there's lots of different roles and responsibilities represented. We've got developers. We've got some people wearing multiple hats, doing dev, doing testing. We've got people that are in charge of lines of business, people that are exploring automated testing, some people that have started doing it. My name's Brad Hunt, and today we're going to talk about our journey to automated testing. And I don't know if this is supposed to be me. It needs a little more gray hair maybe, but this I will be your guide on this journey. I want to tell you about what we've been doing with automated testing and where we've come and where we hope to go. And this is our agenda for today. Our agenda is the map of our journey. And we started Smooth Fusion back in 2001, and it was a little bit of a digital desert back then. And then we started developing some QA processes over the years. Our QA has changed over time as our projects have started to change. And then sort of a chance encounter last year at Progress Next with Zach led us here and led us to start using Test Studio, so we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about what things we're doing today and things that we've figured out that are working for our organization and things that we hope to do in the future. And as we get closer to the end for some samples, there are a few screenshots that have code, and so I don't know how easy it's going to be to see for you guys in the back, but so it's hopefully a little bit of content for everybody that's in the room. But first, just to tell you a little bit about Smooth Fusion and who we are and what we do, so you have a perspective on the kinds of things that we do. We're based in Texas, and welcome to a guy from Dallas. It's nice to see another Texas person in the room. We are ultimately a web application development company, but we also build other kinds of applications, including native script applications, and work with some other technologies as well. We've been around about 18 years. We're pretty small. We've got about 25 employees today, but we do have employees in various roles. So we've got 2 full-time QA testers. We have developers, software engineers, account management, project management. And so even though we're small, we've tried to really develop roles and responsibilities within our organization and be specialists in what we do. We got started with a Progress suite of tools way back in the Telerik days with Sitefinity. We've been working with Sitefinity since version 3.7. And really, for the last 8 years, we've really been focused on Sitefinity. That's the only partner program we're a part of. We decided as a team to really focus on what we thought was the best in breed CMS and try to be efficient not only from project management, but development and all the way through the organization, sales and everything. So being part of the Progress family, that's kind of where we first got introduced to Test Studio. And over the last 18 years, we've completed more than 1,700 projects of various shapes and sizes. Everything from simple one-page sites to download software to room reservation systems and learning management systems, performance review systems, so everything in between. And we do love Sitefinity. We work with Sitefinity quite a bit. It's been great for our business. In 2018, probably 55% of our work was Sitefinity, and the rest was enterprise applications, native apps, things like that. We do have certified consultants and developers on staff. The Digital Experience Cloud is something that's pretty new for us. We've got 2 staff members who are DEC certified, and I'm one of those, went through that process last year. So if you haven't heard about DEC, that's a cool functionality of Sitefinity that allows you to do personalization and a lot of cool features around personalization, and it's a software as a service add-on that can be added to Sitefinity. So if you haven't explored that, if you're into Sitefinity, maybe check that out. And over the last 18 years, we've been lucky enough to serve lots of cool customers and lots of brands from around the country, so we're proud of that. So again, this is our agenda and this is the map of our journey, and I want to emphasize that this is our journey and it's something that's still in process. We haven't got everything figured out. We're still figuring out what our best practices. We're still learning how to use Test Studio. We're learning how to include automated testing in our organization. And there may be some things in here that are helpful for you, but there may be some things that we'll figure out later are not best practice. So your mileage may vary on all this stuff as well. But Smooth Fusion started in 2001, 18 years ago, and so the landscape was very different in 2001. Very much was like a desert. At that time, there was no iPhones, so we weren't worried about developing or testing for phones or mobile or anything like that. There was no Chrome, there was no Firefox, and believe it or not, IE5 had 68% of the market share. So if you're a developer that worries about supporting IE10 or IE11, just think about IE5 back in 2001. It was pretty bleak back then. But as Smooth Fusion developed and as our processes developed, we ended up with a more formal QA process. And by about 2003 or so, we did have a formal QA team. So we started with one and eventually added a second QA tester. And we really tried to formalize our process. So we tested sites as a new user would. We tested for functionality. We tested for links. We tested for spelling and grammar and all these kinds of things. And we also did basic functional checking and link checking. And also, in a lot of cases, we had specific test cases based on the functionality of the site. And at that time, our QA team came up with what we were calling the QA matrix. And I found a copy of the QA matrix from 2004. Kind of looks like a 2004 Excel document. But across the bottom, there were a bunch of tabs for things like basic QA, privacy and security, usability. It looks like we had a tab specifically for shopping carts, so I think we were doing a bunch of shopping cart work at that time. Site updates, so whenever we deployed updates to a site, things that we'd check. And this was pretty robust. This had a lot of things we would check and a lot of ways we would try to break forms and test buttons and test various international addresses and things like that. So manual QA is something we've always done and something we tried to have a formal process for, and we still do a lot of manual QA today. Test automation hasn't really solved it all for us, but our roots are still in a lot of manual QA, and it sounds like a lot of you in the room are the same way. And then along the way, I think there was a few opportunities where we were introduced to automated tools. So for example, we had employees maybe that came from another organization and they had done some automated testing and encouraged us to try something. So one of the ones I remember looking at along the way was Selenium. That's one you guys may have heard of. And I think for us at the time, the tool was not very mature. We probably weren't really ready for that at the time. I think it was a little complex for our QA staff because our QA staff tends not to be developers. They're more QA testers. So they're more looking at functionality. They're not actually in code and working with code. So for us, the timing just was never right sort of to go down that path with automated testing in the past. And then what happened is over the years, we started to see our project landscape really changing. As we moved from projects that were mostly kind of brochure websites or small websites with a lot of functionality, what we started to get involved with was more and more true applications where there's multiple roles, multiple users, multiple groups, people doing different kinds of activities on the site, seeing different content based on the role that user was in. And so the need for consideration of automated testing was stronger just because there was so much more to test and so much more to worry about. So I just want to mention one of the customers that we work with that kind of falls into this category, and this is a company called CEV, and they are an educational company, and they work with independent school districts across the country. And originally they got their start by selling VHS tapes, and they would physically ship VHS tapes to teachers who would use this information in their classroom. But over a number of years, we helped them move from that model to an online model where they first they took all the DVD content. I don't know if we bumped the light, but you can turn it back on either way. Or you can leave it off, but everybody will fall asleep. So they first started with VHS tapes, then they moved to DVDs, then we helped them put the videos online. And at first, that's all they had. It was just online videos, so students would come and watch, or maybe they wouldn't watch, we didn't know. But over time, we helped them develop a platform where teachers could create courses, and the courses had lessons, and the lessons have activities. And it's all kind of interactive stuff where they use a third party called Learnosity. And Learnosity allows them to do interactive assessments and homework assignments. And so every student has a login, every teacher has a login. So everything's very customized based on the courses that they're enrolled in. So in this case, it was a view for a teacher who's looking at a list of lessons. Then we also have a view for students who are logged in, watching videos, they're reading PowerPoints, they're reading PDFs, and they're all participating in the interactive activities as well. And then we have a whole separate back-end administration site. So the staff members that work at CEV can administer curriculum and courses and trial accounts and organizations and certifications and all the kind of stuff that you would think you might have to manage in a software as a service. And so, as you can imagine, there's lots of different use cases that need to be tested every time an application is changed or every time code is rolled out to this application. This site actually gets 10 million visits a month, which is kind of surprising for an educational app, but that's because they have almost 500,000 students and about 3,000 teachers and several thousand organizations that use this now. And so you can imagine if as a development company we make a change, like say on a Tuesday afternoon, and we roll out some kind of new feature and we haven't tested that well, then the next morning in first period when all the students come to class and they all start hitting this application, things go wrong, then the support team at CEV is the first line of defense, and they start emailing us, oh no, something's wrong, something's wrong. And when it's teachers in first period that get messed up, teachers like to sort of have a common curriculum and a common workflow through the day. So if something first period goes wrong, then the whole day is sort of off, and then it's a bad way, and we're feeling bad because we've ruined all these teachers' days. So what we do in these cases is we're manually testing, and we've always manually tested this. So we'd roll out a feature, we'd spend like an hour testing all of the logins to make sure it still logs in as a teacher and a student and a organizational admin and things like this, on top of actually testing all the new functionality that we'd also deployed. So you can imagine that's a lot of extra manual testing just every time we make a little change. And this is on load balanced on 3 servers, and so we're always testing to make sure each server also has the latest updated code and stuff like that. So it just really becomes a very manual process, very tedious. Since 2001, our company has used the same time tracking system, and we log every hour that we spend, and we track that down to the role. And so I did a little bit of analysis before this presentation and found that, and these are the years that we've been in business, so by about 2018, we had logged 40,000 hours of manual QA. And that's even higher than that now, but this is manual QA. So at some point last year, we'd already hit 40,000 hours, and that's a lot of hours. So 40,000 hours is 1,600 days, 4.56 woman years, and I say that because both of our QA leads are women. And that's also 4 Malcolm Gladwells. So if you're into being an expert on something, we've got four experts and 2 people there in QA. But again, it's all manual. This is all just manual things that they've been doing over the years, and they're really good at it, but it's all manual QA. So as I mentioned last year, I was hanging out in the booth and ran into Zach, and it was probably the last day, and we were just kind of shooting the breeze. And I had heard about Test Studio. I knew that it was part of the Progress portfolio, but it wasn't something we really had dug into before. Didn't really know how we might introduce that into our organization, but again, last day, we're just shooting the breeze, so we started talking about it. And I had this ICEV project on my mind because it was May, and we had just spent the whole school year dealing with rolling out stuff and dealing with issues when things go bad. And so it really sounded appealing to be able to create automated tests and run bill verification tests and regression tests and start using the tool to reduce our workload and sort of automate some of those processes. So after that meeting, went home, we downloaded the software. I first personally played with the software, downloaded the trial version to see if I could use it. And I've got some experience in development, experience in various kinds of roles, and so I thought, well, if I can start playing with it, then maybe I can help introduce this to our QA team. So that's what I did. I downloaded the trial version. There's some good videos online on YouTube. They've got some playlists that show how to get started. So I watched some of those, created some basic tests, and then I spent some time with our QA team because as you guys know, if you're trying to introduce a new piece of software into your organization, if you don't have buy-in from all the people using it, then you're effectively just wasting money on software. So the first thing I did was talk to the people that would be using this tool every day and I showed them some demos of stuff that I had learned. And then I think we had a phone call with the sales guys, and they also got to ask questions, and so they were very helpful through that process. They showed us how to do some basic testing as well. I think we used this ICEV as an example and thought about how could we introduce testing in our organization. Then once the QA team kind of felt like, yeah, we think we can do that, we can take that on, because a lot of the functionality in Test Studio, for those of you that haven't used it, you can do quite a bit of testing just through point and click and recording the actions on a site and then playing them back in various browsers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the QA team felt like, yes, I can do that, I can take that on, that's not too complicated. So then we also worked with our IT team. So we do all of our hosting in Azure, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. But we wanted to think about how could we use Test Studio and integrate it into our actual process. Some of you in the room said you were involved with IT and deployments and kind of stuff. So we thought about that. How can we include tests in our process and really bake it into what we do? We talked with our developers to kind of talk with them about how they can work together with QA to use a Visual Studio plugin to do testing. And so they were on board with that. And we do, in our company, every Tuesday morning, we do what's called a 10-minute talk, and somebody talks for 10 minutes. And so I gave a 10-minute talk on Test Studio and kind of showed the whole company what we thought it could do, how we thought we could use it. And then finally, our exec team sort of had to make the decision, the purchase decision, and then we had to talk about licenses and all that. So this is not the very sexy stuff, not very exciting, but it's stuff that it's important for you to consider is how are you going to get buy-in from the team? How do you envision actually using this in your process? So then, of course, once you've made the decision to purchase a piece of software, you got to figure out how are we going to start to adopt this? How are we going to actually use it and move from purchase to being successful? So what we did is we looked at all the suite of things that we use, so all the tools in our backpack on our journey. So on the left, the hammer is AppFair, which we use for a build server to build Sitefinity sites and other code. The briefcase is Jira, so we log all of our bugs and user stories and use cases in Jira and assign them to developers for completing work. The binoculars is Octopus Deploy. That's the deployment pipeline that we use to move NuGet packages from like dev to stage to live. The canteen is Bitbucket, so we use Bitbucket as our source control, and we wanted to figure out how to implement tests with source control. The frying pan is Azure, so everything we do in Azure is kind of the container for everything that we do. And then the flashlight is statement of work, which kind of guides our journey. And statement of work is important because we have to think about actually how to present these tests to our clients and effectively get them to pay for them. And then we kind of saw the Test Studio as a Swiss Army knife because you can do lots of things with it. So we wanted to figure out, can we really use this tool as part of our collection of tools? And so that's what we've been spending the last several months doing, is really trying to integrate this across our teams and across our tool set. So that's kind of where we stand today. We're in the process, we're on our journey, we don't have everything figured out. We're still kind of learning as we go and trying to learn what the best practices are. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about next is exactly what we're doing. So I mentioned that we've got various roles within our organization, account managers and project managers. And although they've been introduced to the tool, it's different to learn how to sort of sell the tool and talk about it and talk about testing with your clients, because you have to sort of understand the value proposition and why, as a customer, why would I pay for that? And this may be a little different in your organization if you're doing testing just for your own internal purposes versus if you're in a professional services model and you're serving other customers, you're having to justify the extra cost, for example, for a statement of work. Because it does take time to do manual testing, it does take time, to do automated testing, it takes time to learn the software, it takes time to set up the test, but the real return is when you start running those over and over and over. So we educated our staff on sort of what does that mean, what is automated testing, what is build verification test, how do you talk to your customers about that. We have some statement of work templates that we use for all of our projects. And so we added language to our statements of work to make sure that it covered build verification testing. And we had to figure out, well, what does that really mean? So if you've got a Sitefinity site, for example, that maybe it's got just a couple of key pieces of functionality like a contact form or a response form, making sure we're setting up tests for those particular things, because we're generally not just doing automated testing for pages of content. And then also I mentioned adding time to our project estimates. So over the years, we've developed a formula and kind of a process and an estimation template based on how many development hours a project's going to take, we can usually figure out how much QA and how much project management is going to take. So we had to sort of adjust that to add extra time for project management. Again, this is not all the sort of exciting stuff, but it's stuff to really consider when you're adopting testing for your organization. So now let's shift gears. I'm going to show a bunch of screenshots and talk a little bit more about the tool and about how we're using it. And as I was asking people as you came in the room, I don't think many people are actually using Test Studio today. So I'll try to give you a little bit of overview of how it works and what it does and how we're using it. So first off, our actual QA testers themselves are using Test Studio Desktop Edition. And the desktop is a piece of software that you download and install on your computer, and you get the license key installed. And when you first open the software, like any software, it takes a little bit of time to get used to what are all the windows, what is the functionality, what does it do, and really what am I looking at. But in this case, we've just got one simple test. So down the left-hand side, you see like a solution explorer, much like you would in Visual Studio, and you see the individual tests. And on the right-hand side, you see the individual test steps. And so to get these test steps, basically what you're doing is you're recording the HTTP traffic, you're recording the session as you start to browse through a site and perform actions. So it may be a little hard to read from the back, but in this test, basically what's happening is we're navigating to a site, we are going to a contact form, we're completing the contact form, and we're submitting that contact form. And every step along the way is being captured in Test Studio, and that happens because you have browser plugins that communicate back with the desktop, and it's recording all the individual steps. Once you have the individual steps recorded, you can simply play those back, and you can play them back in any kind of browser. So any browser that you have locally that you have the plugin, so you can record in IE and play back in Chrome or play back in Firefox or whatever you want to use there. So that's the real power of it, is that you record the test, you can just point and click, and then you play them back in any browser. You can save those tests, and you can also create test lists. So for example, if the CEV example I gave, let's say we want to log in as a teacher, we want to test a grade report, we want to download a PDF, we want to do, say, 5 actions, then we want to do 5 actions for a student. We want to make sure a student can see something on the screen that they can log in and take action. So we can develop all those tests, and we can group them in folders, and then we can go to the test list area, and we can create test lists, and we can play those back. And so once we've taken the time to record those 15 tests, it's easy to play those back, and we can play those back in any browsers, and then you get results back from that, and you can see what tests fail. So one thing that's been a challenge or a change for our QA team is, and this is something you should consider in your organization if you've got QA testers that are doing manual QA, they're probably really looking at the functionality of the site. They're just making sure that they can visually see something worked or that they got the email when a form was submitted. But when you're writing a test and you want to verify that test works, you're looking for things in the DOM. You're looking to make sure that a specific div has a specific thank you message or that the redirect worked in a certain way. And so it's a little bit different change in mentality for the QA people to think about, not just that I'm going to see that it worked, but how as a QA person can I ensure that it worked? What can I check for in the DOM to make sure that that test worked? And that takes a little bit of a different mindset shift for the QA people, because again, they're not used to thinking about the DOM, unless you've got developers in your organization who are also testing. So that's the little basics of how to use the desktop tool. But a couple things specifically from the tool that we found helpful. One thing is it's got built-in integration to bug tracking systems, and I mentioned that we use Jira. And so it's really easy to connect to Jira. Once you've got a project inside of Test Studio, you can just use your username and password and connect to Jira. We've got an online subscription for Jira. And so you just basically put in your username and password, and then it will show you a drop-down list of all the projects that you have in Jira. And then you connect that one Jira project to this Test Studio project. And then if you actually have a test failure, you can submit that to Jira. So in this case, you can see at the top, hopefully it says step failure details. And this is a contact form submission. And once the contact form has been submitted, we were looking in our test for a specific piece of text that said, thank you for submitting. And in this case, it failed because the expected result didn't match the actual result. So we recorded this test, we had an expected result, we played it back, and it failed. And so now what a QA person can do from this screen is if something failed, there's a button at the bottom that says Submit Bug, and they can click on that, and it'll pop up a window. I've already connected to Jira, and so it pre-populates the bug name and populates the description of the bug, and then attach failure details is really cool because it sticks a zip file into the attachments of the Jira item, and it will have the DOM at the time of failure. It'll have a screenshot of the actual result, a screenshot of the expected result, and these are all things that the developer can then use to troubleshoot. So here's what that looks like in Jira. The reporter is me because I'm the one that used my username and password to connect Test Studio to Jira. And then it was already assigned to our VP of development because she was the default person on that project. And then it's got the zip file with all of the details from the test failure. So it's very straightforward to use. Now there's a lot more that you can do with it, especially from the development side. You can write coded tests. You don't have to just point and click. But that's a great way to get started, again, especially for non-technical QA people. And one of the other things that we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that we could integrate the tests in source control. So out of the box, Test Studio Desktop supports integration with source control. And I think when you go to connect source control, you'll see it comes with Git and TFS. And we use Bitbucket, which under the covers uses Git. And so we were able to connect Test Studio to Bitbucket without any, well, we did have a couple problems, and I'll talk about that in lessons learned in a minute. But we got it to work. So this is another thing, though, that I think you need to think about for QA testers, especially if they're not developers and they're not used to working with source control. Because for a QA person to think about, well, what does a commit mean? And what does a pull mean? And what does a push? And I don't understand this idea of using this desktop IDE to push and pull and make sure I have the latest and I have a merge conflict. What does that mean? So this is an area that we're still working with on our QA, again, because that's just a different world than they're used to living in. And then for developers, Test Studio comes with a Visual Studio plugin. And so this is a screenshot of the Visual Studio plugin. It's got, I think, most of the same functionality that you find in the desktop. I've found one or two small things that you can't do, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in general, same concept. You can use this plugin. You as a developer can record tests and then just take some action on a website. All of the individual steps are recorded exactly like they are in the desktop. And since the developers are used to working in source control, it's not a big deal for them to go open a project in source control, download the test, see the test, and then in case if there's a bug, then they'll execute that test and make sure, if they see the same failure, they'll work to fix the test, and then they'll run the test again to make sure everything works. So that's been a very, very familiar thing because it is integrated, and I think that's a great feature because then developers haven't had to learn a new piece of software. It feels very tightly integrated with Visual Studio. Now, some of you in the room, as you came in, I asked you, and you were developers and IT ops or DevOps or maybe some combination thereof. So a big thing for us was also to figure out how to really integrate Test Studio into our deployment pipeline, into our CI/CD stuff, and to make sure that we could run tests as a build was, or as a code was committed and built. So the idea there is what we want to do is we want our QA people to develop a list of tests so that every time a developer checks in code and that project is built, that test list is executed, and we can say that developer hasn't broken anything with their latest code commit. So this is a simplified version of our model, but developers work on their local machines. They check code into Bitbucket. Bitbucket has hooks into AppVeyor. AppVeyor runs through a series of build scripts or build commands, configuration options, which then deploys NuGet packages. So Octopus Deploy then spins up the site on the Azure Dev site, and then we use Octopus Deploy to move code from dev to staging to live, or how many ever environments that we have. Now, when we looked at the documentation, Test Studio has pretty good documentation, I think, for TFS or for Azure DevOps. We didn't really find anything about AppVeyor. I think there's documentation around Jenkins and some other build servers. So we sort of had to roll our own, and this may be a version where, or an example of maybe we're not doing best practices, and we'll get some good feedback today maybe on how we can make this a little bit better. But we decided to integrate Test Studio at our AppVeyor layer, so when builds are happening on the build server. And so I want to talk about that process a little bit. So what we do, this is Bitbucket, so this is our source control. And what we have set up here is 2 different repositories. We have a naming convention already where every client gets a number, every project gets a number, and then we create project names, repo names based on that. So the one at the bottom is 00168 Sitefinity demo, and that happens to be a Sitefinity site. It's the quantum demo that you may have seen in other sessions. And then we created a second repository just called Test Studio on the end. We're trying to kind of come up with some naming conventions for our organization where that would actually store the tests, so just the tests instead of the source code for the application. So this is a screenshot from Bitbucket. And because we use AppVeyor, every project in Bitbucket that's going to be built by AppVeyor has an appveyor.yaml file, and YAML is just basically a configuration script. And so it's got some hooks into AppVeyor and all of these various commands like build and after build and deploy. These are things that are just part of that deployment, and it tells AppVeyor what to do. And so what I've highlighted here, and again, I'm sorry if you can't read it from the back, but I've circled here a couple things in red. So some new things that we added for Test Studio specifically. So when we do, when you use AppVeyor, what's actually happening is it's spinning up a VM, and it's spinning up a fresh VM, and then it's doing the build, and then it disposes of the VM when it's done. So in our case, that VM spins up, and so it has to have Test Studio installed to be able to run those tests. And so we've got some PowerShell scripts that's basically running like a web client, and so it's just hitting a location to grab that MSI file, the installer file. And so this path is just somewhat arbitrary. That's a path that we had for a location that was addressable in Azure that allowed us to download that MSI. So your path would be different, or wherever you want to get that, or maybe Test Studio provides that in a way that you can download. So the first thing we're doing is actually downloading that installer on that server that's been spun up. Then we run the install command so that that software is installed on the server. And then there's some stuff that we do on every project, like with Sitefinity. We're using the NuGet packages so that our source control doesn't have all the build artifacts and DLLs and everything. We're actually letting AppVeyor go to NuGet and pull all that down and then perform the build on AppVeyor. So that happens, and then eventually the code that's been built on AppVeyor needs to get deployed. And then we also have some custom things for Test Studio here in this after deploy method. So because we have 2 different repos, we have a repository for the test and a repository for the code. We also have to pull down a local copy of the test project, and that's what this one is. So here's that naming convention. There's a variable and then Test Studio at the end to tell it to pull down the test project. And then we've got 3 custom PowerShell scripts. They could probably be all integrated into one, but just for modularity and for explainability, we've got those divided. The first thing we do is a health check. And as I was talking to several people as you came in the room, I heard that several people are Sitefinity developers, and so you probably know, both for local development and when you deploy, you often see the gears because the site has to spin back up in memory. It's got to create all the local cache, and so it just takes a while for a Sitefinity site to come up. So if you think about what we're doing here is we've committed code, we've committed some kind of change. AppVeyor's got to build that, and then it's got to deploy to the dev site. The dev site's going to take a couple minutes to warm up and for the gears to go away, and we don't want to start testing until the gears have gone away because then the tests are pointless. So the first thing we do is this health check script, and what the health check does, again, this is something we've come up with that hopefully this is the right way to do it. But we're hitting the URL, and Sitefinity actually has a built-in health check API endpoint. I think this was added in maybe Sitefinity version 10. If you can't see it, it's just at REST API/health. And so we've got this PowerShell script that basically, first thing it does is it like waits for 2 or 3 minutes to give time for Sitefinity to spin up. And then it hits that API endpoint, and it's looking to make sure that that returns true. And if that hasn't spun back up, then it basically waits again, and it goes through this sort of iterative loop. And this is what that looks like. Here's what the API call looks like. It's pretty straightforward. But if Sitefinity is still in the process of spinning up, then this page either won't load, or it'll be just a white screen, or it will turn healthy equals false. And so as long as it's healthy equals true, we know it's good to go ahead and start running the tests. And so that's what that last script does once it's true. Then we actually have the PowerShell scripts that are calling the exe that actually performs the test. So this art of test.runner exe is what's running the test. and we're passing in a test list. And again, we've sort of tried to establish a naming convention internally where we've got a test list that's called build tests. So what'll happen is the QA people will develop those tests and just, again, make sure they're named the right thing so the scripts can pick them up. And then what happens is we take the output from the HTML, and then we'll send that via email. I'll show you that next. So this is a little bit of a longer script, but it's something we already had in place. And it basically just looks at the output and sends that in as HTML attachment in an email. So that's really all that does. And because we're using AppVeyor, the nice thing about AppVeyor, it does have a console that we can watch as the build's happening and as the steps are going through. And so that's kind of what you see here. You see I've made a commit, so there's my commit message. So it's yellow, it's in the process of building, and you can see the output on that server as things happen. So first thing we did is we cloned that branch of the Sitefinity project. We downloaded that MSI that I showed you in the other script. And then it's going through all the actual builds and warnings and whatever it may show for the build of Sitefinity. And then later on down the script, here's another section I've got highlighted. This is where we're actually cloning the test repo to get the tests locally. And you can see the health check running. And then we actually run the test. And in this particular test, we just have one test in our test list. And so you can actually see every line, like it's navigating to the form, it's going to the contact, it's putting Brad in the first name and Hunt in the last name, and so on. And we can see that this test passed. And once the test passed, it generates an HTML file that we then can look for in PowerShell and send the email. And one of the things we had to figure out, ended up being very trivial, but what was happening the first time we did this is we would build and the test would fail. And so because the test failed, the whole build would fail. And then this would just get stuck and we didn't know how to, what to do. So we added this very simple exit command, exit 0. So if the test fails, we still want the build to work and we still want to be notified of what happened so that we can see the failed test. But we want the overall build to work, if that makes sense. So that was an easy solution to that problem. So once it all finishes, then the last thing it does is send an email. So this is an area we'd like to improve because right now the emails just come to kind of our admin NetOps team, but we've got variables in there where we can send the email to our QA team and also the person who checked it in, because you can see here we know that in this case it was me that did the code commit. And then when you look in the body of that email, this is, by the way, this is all output provided for Test Studio. It's not something that we did custom, the HTML itself. That's just an artifact that you get out of Test Studio at the end of the process. It's an HTML result so that you can see. And you can see every test and what passed, and then if one of the steps failed, you'd be able to see that and see why it failed. And then the last thing we do, we use Teams in our environment. Teams is similar to Slack, but it's a Microsoft product. And so at this moment, all we have is we just have a notification in Teams that says that the build has worked successfully. What we'd like to add to this, I don't think it would be that much harder to do, is basically adding that attachment too, so that the HTML result shows up in a Teams channel for just like an AppVeyor team that we've created in there. So a couple of lessons that we've learned throughout the process. Again, we don't have everything figured out. We're still learning as we go. First observation I would make is that we really need to master test creation, because even though we've got this infrastructure set up now and we think we have everything sort of working end to end, the teams can collaborate, we really just need to understand fundamentally how to get good at writing good tests, because we're not working on just one application. We're serving on any month, we're serving 30 to 40 clients and projects in different states, and some harder and some easier. So sometimes it's like a form that's been embedded through HubSpot, say, and maybe we have to tweak the test so that it has the appropriate time delays or simulates real typing, things like that. So just getting really good at actually knowing how to create tests that test the scenarios that we want to test. The second thing I mentioned earlier is that our QA team has had to learn to be a little more technical. So in the past, they haven't worried about the DOM. They haven't worried about how do I actually know this test passed, because they're not having to worry about something that can programmatically be recreated. They're just worried about, like, do I see on the screen what I expect to see? And so that's been a little bit of a shift, is trying to get our QA people to think about that and think about the output and think about how to write good tests. Another lesson learned was around source control. And I mentioned this, that I would come back to it earlier. So when we first started writing tests, what we tried to first do imagine if you're a developer, this might make most sense. But if you're working in Visual Studio, you've got all the source code in a solution. We first just try to add a test list folder inside that solution and put all our tests in there. And that's a bad idea for two reasons. One is the tests themselves can also have code. So you can have C# code behind a test, like maybe you want to use a function that creates a random first name or random last name as you're testing a form. So if you're writing code that doesn't compile, then you've got a problem with your overall project, and it's something from your test then that's breaking it. A secondary problem that we found is when you're using Test Studio Desktop and you're trying to open things from source control, we couldn't get it to open from source control unless the test project was at the root of the repo, because the test project looks for a settings file that's in the root, and if you've got it buried in a test list folder, it wouldn't work. So then we thought, well, let's put that in a separate project in the same solution. That seemed like a logical thing to try. But really the same thing happened was the Test Studio Desktop couldn't find that settings file. And maybe that's something we can work on with the product team and solve that, because I think ideally we'd probably like it if they could be in one repo, because otherwise you're putting multiple repositories and you're just sort of bloating your source control. And again, maybe I'll figure out that's not the best way to do it anyway. Another thing we stumbled across is that test lists are not supported in Visual Studio, and that is a developer can't go into Visual Studio and create a test list, a list of things that get executed. But our environment, or in our methodology, that's probably not a big deal, because our QA testers are the ones that are really creating build tests and the ones that are going to outline what things have to happen during build. But that's something to be aware of. In the documentation, there was a sort of workaround for that by sort of manually creating a file, because ultimately I think it's just JSON that defines what those test lists are. But I couldn't get that to work. So we had to create our test lists inside of Test Studio. And then I think I mentioned that last one already. So with our binoculars, and we're looking ahead to the future, what's next with Test Studio, we'd like to get into some coded tests. So as our developers start doing more testing, creating tests themselves instead of relying on QA people to do the test, letting developers write code behinds for their test and actually getting the C# coded test. We do a lot of work with native applications and also things like portals or just systems that have API layers. And Test Studio can test APIs as well. And again, that's another shift in mentality, because if you've used Postman or if you've used other tools to test APIs, there's no interface. You know, you're just posting data and you're talking about puts and gets and posts, and you're figuring out the status codes that come back. So I think that Test Studio will help abstract some of that, but it's also something that the testers have to have some familiarity with. Mobile apps, so Test Studio also has an SDK that you can use to put inside your mobile application, so you can test, use automated UI testing on your mobile applications, and that's something we've not done yet. And then also load testing. We've done load testing in the past with other tools like PRTG or other tools that can simulate high loads. But the advantage that we see to using Test Studio for that is once we've created these tests really represent real world functionality on the site and things that the user's actually going to do. So with Test Studio, you can use a separate test runner application, and you can just have it spin up a whole bunch of tests, and you can simulate load under sort of real conditions. So those are some things that we hope to do in the future. So we're getting close to the end of our time, I think, but I'd be happy to take a couple of questions, and if I can't answer them, maybe Ilian can answer them if they're more technical. Yes, sir?
You found that you have a baseline set of tests that you run against every project, and then have specific ones, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're still trying to figure that out, but that's one thing we'd like to do is try to create a library of tests that can be reused between projects. Because especially with things like Sitefinity, we tend to do a lot of the same things over and over. I think part of that depends on how you do the test, because if the tests are testing for specific elements in the DOM, and then every project the developers have named those elements differently, then they might be a little bit more brittle. But within Test Studio, I think part of the power of that is they've got a way that they match all the elements behind the scenes. So they use a number of different techniques to do that. So I think part of that is also training the testers on how to develop good tests that are not brittle, that aren't going to break from project to project. The other thing we've tried to do is think about creating a data-driven test. So you can attach a data set behind a test, run a test over and over and over, and populate it with different data each time. So we've thought about things like a contact form that's something common that you test over and over and over. Maybe we can develop some data sets that we reuse so that every form always gets this standard set of whatever, 8,000 pieces of data or something. So it's something we've identified that we'd like to do, but we haven't gotten there yet. So the question, just to repeat, is can you test things that are happening behind the scenes, something that's not on the client side? So I'm going to let Ilian answer that question, put you on the spot. Do you mind? I don't know if that's on. Test it. See if that's on.
So yes, you can actually test what's happening behind. So if you have some kind of input on the UI and a bunch of stuff is happening behind, you can either do this with our API testing if you have APIs on the back end to test if everything is correctly recorded or all the features are working behind, or you can either, if you have something really like custom, you can add some coded steps, and with those coded steps you can actually do almost anything. Get into a database, we have a lot of samples that you can reuse to check a database, pull some data from it, or that kind of stuff. And you can also combine web tests and API calls in one, web UI tests and API calls in one. So you can do something on the UI, and the next step is actually an API call that verifies if something happened.
And thank you very much. So Ilian's the product manager for Test Studio. So if you've got questions that are more technical like that, or how to use the product, or things that it can or can't do that I can answer, I'm sure he'll be around so you can find him. And we'll be at our booth. We have a booth downstairs if you have any other questions for us. But I think we're at our time. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.